Welcome to our panelists. Thanks again for joining us. We're going to kick it off with Bob Davis, senior editor at the Wall Street Journal. Bob has been covering trade since around the 90s and is encyclopedic about these issues. He's also the author of a new book called Superpower, Showdown with Wang. I would also mention that Wang was one of the reporters who was forced to leave China recently in the tit-for-tat expulsions, and so Bob can also brief us on that. And we're going to ask him to tell us what he sees coming down the pike in U.S. China trade and general relations. Okay, Bob, over to you.
All right. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. I'm really flattered to be here. Here's the book. I worked on this book with my colleague in Beijing, Lingling Wei. Lingling and I have worked together since about 2011 when I was first posted in Beijing. I was there from 2011 to 2014. Lingling was a Chinese national, born in China, raised in China, went to college in China, married a Chinese husband, and they both came to the U.S. as grad students. Both of them became U.S. citizens and was one of the first, maybe the first, of her sort. I mean, a Chinese national became a U.S. citizen with a U.S. passport, went back to cover her home country. But because she had a U.S. passport, she could write under her own byline. As people might know, that if you're a Chinese national, you can't write for a Western publication under your own byline. So we were working together 2011, 2014. Lingling has just amazing sources in China that I couldn't hope to replicate. You know, and I'd worked at the Wall Street Journal basically forever, and you know, knew how to write bigger kinds of stories that the journal wanted, and we had a very, very good working relationship. I went back to the U.S. in 2014. She stayed, and we continued to work together in a trans-Pacific kind of you know, relationship. And then in the past 3 years, with the intensification of the trade disputes and the economic battle between the two countries, that's largely what we worked on for really pretty much 3 years. And at the end of 2018, we pitched it to a book agent who got us a contract to write what we looked at as a first draft of history from this trade dispute. As I think people may know, so it's December 2018, we figured it'd be over by the summer of 2019. That was kind of what everybody figured at that point. And it just went on and on and on and on, which was the most difficult part of reporting the book. Some people think, well, it must be very hard working across the Pacific. Not really. I mean, Lingling and I do stories together all the time, but trying to write a book that tells the history of the U.S.-China trade relationship and economic relationship starting in the Clinton and Zhu Rongji era, while the whole thing is still entirely up in the air, was really quite difficult. But I think both of us looked at this as an important moment in history. We talk about it as a romance gone bad. I mean, the countries had been on a path of engagement, I mean, really starting with the Nixon, you know, Kissinger, Mao efforts, but with a big detour after the Tiananmen Square killings. But, you know, since the early 90s with Clinton, they had worked more and more in alignment, although that kind of broke down in 2008 with the global financial crisis, which I can go into more detail later. And things, even though that was in some ways a high point of the relationship, the two countries working together to pull the global economy out of a recession, it also began the beginning of a spiraling downward in the relationship as well. But the last 3 years, so the way we look at it is that Trump didn't start the trade war, and the trade war is not going to end if Trump loses the election or if he, you know, finishes a second term. It's more fundamental issues at stake. But still, the last 3 years have been, you know, an enormous intensification, a clear break from the engagement, excuse me, the engagement that has marked the relationship between the two countries since the early 90s. So in doing the book, and again, I can talk about this more as we go along, I mean, there were a number of, I would say, revelations for us as the writers, different ways in which we wound up looking at the main participants, because it is largely, a fight between Trump and Xi Jinping. So even though Trump has this reputation of, just a fierce China opponent, and he certainly campaigned on that in 2016, it's actually a lot more complicated than that. I mean, what we talk about in the book is a blue-collar Trump and a Wall Street Trump. I mean, he does have a genuine aversion to China on a lot of trade issues, and worries about the jobs effect on people who became the core of his supporters. That is legitimate. But he also worries enormously and watches enormously the movements of the stock market. And oftentimes the trade deal, or the uncertainty about the trade relationship, meant that the market would plunge. And that was the clearest signal that Trump would back off, if you saw a market decline. So, and the different factions within that White House would play to one part of Trump versus another part of Trump. And that's why it seemed to lurch from, one way to another way, and you could never really quite tell. And the Chinese were really confused, but so were people in Washington. I mean, it's just a very confusing administration. I've covered a bunch of them. And with Xi Jinping, he came into power in 2012 with a reputation as a reformer. It was an economic reformer, certainly not political, but an economic reformer who came of age in some of the most market-friendly provinces of China, Zhejiang province, Fujian province. He spent a lot of time in both. By all accounts, worked very well with businesses there and foreign businesses. One of the early documents that came out when he came into power talked about a quote-unquote decisive role for the markets. But people really misunderstood him. I think the best definition of his way of looking at things is what he calls the China dream, which to him means a kind of re-emergence of China as a global power. It isn't all that different than Make America Great Again. I mean, you could say that Trump stole the idea from Xi, but it's not all that different. And I think with Xi Jinping, what you see is, yes, he's for market, reforms when he believes it serves the interests of the party. I mean, in the West, we have this notion that hierarchical control by the party is antithetical to the kind of innovative economy that will be the leader in the 21st century. But that's not the way he looks at it. He looks at it as the party guiding the economy. And when market forces work in helping the economy, that's good. And when they don't, so you move more towards state-owned companies. But the party control is the dominant kind of way he looks at things, not the market reforms that, say, an earlier premier, Zhu Rongji, during the China WTO negotiations looked at it, and his number one, Jiang Zemin, the president at that time, also gave him a lot of backing. So I'll stop there. I did want to talk about the expulsions. So Ling Ling got caught up in the tit-for-tat retaliations going on between the U.S. and China. I mean, there are different ways of where you could say it started. But one thing that gave it a big push was a headline in the Wall Street Journal editorial page about China being the quote-unquote sick man of Asia. It was seen as offensive in China, which I understand it was actually pretty offensive. However, it was done by the editorial page. News and editorial in the Wall Street Journal have absolutely nothing to do with one another. There's, if anything, a real dislike, I would say, between the two sections. And it felt really unfair for Wall Street Journal reporters to be targeted as a result. And I think it was essentially an excuse, because the first three reporters that were kicked out were reporters who had focused a lot on Xinjiang and were Chinese American or Chinese, ethnic Chinese who spoke Chinese very well. And then in the second round of tit for tat, they threw out all the American reporters from the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal. Ling Ling was one of them. I don't think she was targeted, but she was caught up in it. And she, of all the reporters, had the most to lose. As I say, if China had a dual citizenship, if China allowed for dual citizenship, she'd be a dual citizen. But they don't allow for it, so she only has American citizenship. But her family is in China. Her mother, her father, who she's very close to, are there. She thought about quitting just to stay with them, but realized that that would have been a tremendous mistake, because she had been, she was a prominent journalist in China. The party and the government had her number, and she would have been under the thumb of the government from then on. So she's back in the U.S. She's doing her best to try to cover China from a distance, as is the Wall Street Journal in general. And it's a tough slog. It's a tough slog. I mean, it's a really hit to the Journal and to the Times and the Post too. We at one time had as many as 20 reporters. Now we're down to 4. These are Western reporters, I should say. We didn't hire by nationality. It so happened that some of the reporters were from Singapore and Britain, and they're still there in Canada. And I imagine we will probably hire for China by nationality, but it's unclear at this point whether, even if we hire somebody, I don't know, from Singapore, whether that person will get a visa. And I think, and Ling Ling makes this point all the time, it's not just, it's a blow for the Journal, it's a blow for American readers without a doubt, but it is also a blow for Chinese readers and the Chinese elites who depend on American journalism to give a sense of what the West really thinks about what's going on in China, and also, frankly, to interpret what is going on in China in an independent fashion. I think I'm getting toward the end of where I wanted to be, so I'll stop there, and happy during the discussion to talk about different ways that I have think about covering trade and covering China.
Well, thanks so much, Bob. I want to flag for everyone that you can ask questions in the Q&A, and you can also raise your Zoom hand if you want us to call on us. We're going to give priority to journalists in the Q&A. Bob, I'd just like to ask one first question. You've looked a lot at what the campaign positions are. Could you run your crystal ball forward? What is the U.S.-China trade relationship going to look like if Biden wins? And what is it going to look like if Trump is elected to a second term?
Well, let's start with Trump. I mean, if Trump's elected to a second term, you know, I mean, the tensions will continue. I mean, I think pretty clearly he may push for a second round of negotiations, which would be far, I mean, the first round, my God, was difficult enough, but it really dealt with the easier topics. I mean, in the end, the conclusion of the deal, the phase 1 deal, as it's called, dealt with the easier topics, which were increased purchases, some regulatory changes, strengthening of intellectual property. I mean, these are difficult issues, but they pale in comparison to things like the behavior of state-owned enterprises, subsidies, subsidization of Chinese companies, you know, the creation of a truly independent judiciary that can adjudicate commercial, at least commercial disputes in a fair way, changes in regulatory systems. So I think pretty clearly, you know, the tension mount, the movement toward We think decoupling is a kind of fantasy, but the moving toward disengagement continues. There's some more interesting question in my mind is, well, what happens if Biden wins? If Biden wins, I think certainly on the rhetoric, you would see an easing of the rhetoric. He's just not that sort of person, and he won't have come into office by playing off of China, so he won't have to, prove his manhood or whatever, by sounding tough on China. So rhetoric will definitely improve. I think he will, try to revitalize multilateral institutions. I mean, one difference might be the WTO as an institution might not survive a second Trump term. At least the adjudication part, which is really the heart of the institution. I think it pretty clearly would under Biden. But there's a big but. I mean, he would come into office with tariffs on significant U.S. tariffs on 3/4 of everything China sends to the U.S. And he's not just going to, say, okay, fine, let's, repeal it. He'll need to get significant concessions for that, to deal with, the political imperative on him. And so where do those concessions come from? They could be in the difficult issues I just mentioned, or it could even be, or he could be looking for, changes when it comes to human rights, Hong Kong, environmental issues, labor issues, which are, again, way more difficult than dealing with, purchase of soybeans.
Okay, well, thank you so much. I want to turn it over next to Dr. Mary Lovely, who is a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute and also teaches U.S. China economic relations at Syracuse University, the Maxwell Business School. And Dr. Lovely is going to give us a very in-depth view of some of the nuts and bolts of trade, which the academics who have joined us here today will probably be familiar to you, but we hope this will be useful to the journalists. Mary, over to you.
Thank you, Sunny. And I'm going to run through a bunch of slides, hopefully point you to some resources that you may be familiar with, but may not be. And Sunny has helpfully created a whole list of resources for you that I think are very valuable. Just following up on Bob's very interesting discussion, the book, Superpower, Showdown, tells a really fascinating narrative of what we, those of us who are in Washington, lived through over the past few years. Of course, with the previous years as a buildup, so it puts it in context. But it is a story, as Bob said, of never knowing sort of what shoe was going to fall next. However, I think when we look at the numbers, we see that there was continuity in retrospect of an increase in barriers between the two countries. So while the whole process was chaotic and filled with uncertainty, which certainly was felt by businesses on both sides of the Pacific, we see in the end that we are left with a relationship that is vastly altered by the trade war. Tyler, can we move to the next slide? Thank you. So I'm going to be talking about a few things. First, how the U.S. China trade war weaponized protection. Secondly, how to think about the trade war and the damage it does to economies. And here I'm going to focus on the U.S. and China. And my shorthand way is just an own goal. And I think that's important for reporters to keep in mind when they're focusing on particularly what politicians on either side say about their actions. And I'm going to briefly, hopefully if time permits, discuss whether the trade war will bring supply chains home, a rhetoric that has certainly increased since the beginning of COVID-19. Slide. Okay, so first, weaponized protectionism. Here in the United States and China set the pace. And as we see on the next slide, the U.S. weaponized tariffs in service of the goal, which was not directly related to Chinese tariff levels. It was focused on forced technology transfer. So many of you are familiar with the Section 301 case that the U.S. brought. The case itself focuses on 4 different aspects of what the U.S. sees as intellectual property violations, theft, forced tech transfer through joint ventures, and even cyber theft of U.S. IP assets. So that is really what the case was about. The U.S. chose to fight that case with tariffs. So tariffs became weapons to achieve a different aim, which was presumably reform of Chinese practices regarding our technology. As we have seen, and as Ambassador Lighthizer certainly related last week in his congressional testimony, the administration has gradually moved to a more open expression of the tariffs as a way to return manufacturing to the U.S. So the tariffs were weaponized as retaliation for this perceived harm to U.S. interests, but it has since morphed into a more general desire to quote unquote decouple, where that decoupling is specifically aimed at bringing these activities back to the U.S. China, of course, retaliated and chose its targets wisely, focused on particularly on U.S. agricultural exports, which we know did significant damage in U.S. farm country. There was a series of escalating tariff rounds, with each side continuing to erect higher and higher tariff walls, increasing the coverage, but also gradually the rate. We can see that on the next slide. Here I have a useful chart that my colleague at Peterson, Chad Bown, has done. The blue is the U.S. tariff walls, and the red is the China tariff walls. And what we see is that through a series of tit-for-tat rounds, the U.S. and China now maintain an average of 25% tax rates on each other's exports. For the U.S., tariffs continue to cover 2/3 of our imports from China. Importantly is what is not covered, and many of these products that remain uncovered to this day were scheduled to be taxed last December, but President Trump decided to stay his hand on these as the Phase 1 deal was agreed to. These tariffs would largely fall on cell phones, computers, laptops. So many products that are very important to the United States, we design and market these goods, and they support a lot of jobs here in the U.S. On the next slide, we can see that the Phase 1 deal involved very ambitious purchases. And of course, these purchases and the president's desire for these purchases have been in the news quite a bit over the last couple of weeks, with various snippets of John Bolton's book being reported. Here is a tracker that's also being done by Chad Bown, and we see that under the Phase 1 deal, purchases are put into 4 separate categories: agricultural, manufacturing goods, energy, and then we have a bunch of products which are uncovered. And we see here that so far we're way below what we would need, the pace that we would need to reach these targets. Having said that, these are 2-year targets. China does not have to meet a month-by-month target. And of course, the global pandemic has certainly affected both the supply of these goods as each country has gone into lockdown with the pandemic, and demand. And both countries have seen an increase in saving rate and a big drop in consumer spending. So the Phase 1 deals were always extremely ambitious. They were far higher than we would have expected just with simply inflating the trend line from prior to the deal being signed. So they were always ambitious, and the pandemic has certainly made the achievement of these ambitious targets more difficult. Okay, the next slide. On this slide, I highlight some work I did with Chad on the role of state-owned enterprises in China. One question that has come up is, how will China achieve these ambitious goals? And it's always been clear that there would have to be an element of managed trade, which of course is quite ironic, since one of the goals supposedly of U.S. policy is to have economic reform and more reliance on market-driven allocation in China. But the phase 1 deals take us in a different direction, which is that the Chinese government will have to mandate purchases either through its state-owned enterprises or by issuing licenses to private companies. Here we see the use of Chinese customs records that we had access to see which sectors are dominated by state-owned enterprises in terms of their purchasing of imports. And we see for many of these industries, particularly in manufacturing, the sectors are not mainly SOE dominated. The importing is being done by Chinese private firms and foreign invested enterprises. And so to achieve these purchase targets, it would clearly have to be some sort of institution of government control over private actors. So it really does take us in a very different direction from where we thought we were headed with Chinese reform. Next slide. So what about the damage that a trade war does? We hear a lot from politicians that trade wars create jobs, and yet we have a significant amount of evidence now that that simply is not true. And this evidence is going to be very valuable for scholars moving forward. In 2018, I tried to do a analytical piece on the possibility of U.S. tariffs on auto imports. And we had to go way back to the 1970s to have a suitable example to look at how markets responded to higher prices. It had been that long that the U.S. had engaged in this type of increases in its applied rates. Of course, the U.S. has increased tariffs through so-called administered protection, through anti-dumping duties and countervailing duties, but not through its applied rates in this way. Another unique aspect of the trade war is that, of course, it's discriminatory. That is, we're only raising tariffs against one of our partners, not against all partners. So what happened? Let's see. The next slide shows us that the U.S. tariffs on China fell heavily on manufacturing and on their supply chains. So President Trump early on was determined, I think, to try to minimize the effect of tariffs at the retail stores, so your Walmart, Target types of purchases. And that meant that the tariffs would fall heavily on intermediate goods that are purchased, parts and components that are purchased by American manufacturers. These products are largely shipped from foreign factories in China. That is, they're made by companies like Foxconn or Samsung or other companies that are owned by South Korean companies or Japanese companies or Taiwanese companies. We also have looked at so-called related party trade, where the two sides, the buyer and the seller, have an ownership relationship. And those shares are also very high in the U.S. China relationship. So U.S. China trade is largely, I think, misunderstood by the average person who thinks of it as maybe the blouse or home goods that they buy at Target. But the majority of it is really these intermediate inputs, particularly in electronics and machinery. And so the tariffs hit very hard at U.S. manufacturers. Next slide. So what we have now are two very important studies that have been done, and Sunny has provided a link to these in her list of references. What we know is that China did not pay the tariff. U.S. businesses and consumers did. How do economists sort that out? Well, what we look at is the price that is paid to Chinese exporters. With a 25% tax, if the Chinese exporter was going to absorb the tariff, as President Trump has consistently said would happen, we would have seen those prices fall so that the net price to Americans would have stayed the same. That is, we would have passed the tax backward to the Chinese exporter. And looking at those detailed prices, thousands and thousands of prices on goods on which were taxed versus goods that were not taxed before and after, we see that the tax was not passed backward to China, it was passed forward to the US. That conclusion was quite robust. We have that the tariffs were passed through to US importers and then passed what they could on to US buyers. The next slide. Tariffs did not protect US jobs. I think this is a very important thing when reporting on the effect of tariffs. We do see that in firms that receive protection directly, we see some increase in employment, but then we have to net out employment that is lost because many other firms have higher input costs and lose market share. These companies testified when the tariffs were under consideration by the trade representative, Office of the Trade Representative, but the tariffs were then implemented. Tariff increases on imports. You know, these firms accounted for 84% of all of our exports. So these are very important in terms of the American firms which do our exporting and represent about 65% of manufacturing employment. An interesting number from this study is that for all affected firms, the implied cost of the tariff was about $900 per worker. So it's a strange way to, you know, have a job creation program. Other firm level studies, the positive effects of tariffs are more than offset by negative effects of higher prices in terms of employment. There are net employment losses, both because of the increase in costs for American manufacturers, but also because of the retaliatory tariffs that were placed on the U.S., which had a very big effect on U.S., particularly the heartland. The next slide, and I'll try to wrap up soon for you, Sunny. Just did the trade war also inflict damage on China? Next slide. The answer is, of course, yes. What we see when we look at U.S. export prices is that the U.S. did not pay for Chinese tariffs. The Chinese people and businesses paid for the Chinese tariffs. So we have a symmetry here between the two countries. We also see that there were job losses in Chinese manufacturing. We don't have quite as detailed evidence. We don't have the same access to data. But we do know that these jobs are basically a small share of the Chinese economy, as they are for the U.S. China is increasingly a service-driven economy, certainly not to the extent the United States is, but it's harder and harder to hurt China via this method. Next slide. Here we do see, though, that trade volumes between U.S. and China fell dramatically. Goods that were taxed fell an average of 20 to 30%, according to the best studies. So it did have a big impact on the bilateral trade flows. Next slide. Interestingly enough, though, we have to remember that the superpower showdown is happening in terms of a globalized economy. That is, there's a lot of other players in the economy. They did not follow the U.S. lead. They did not put tariffs on China. And what we see here is that the Chinese share of world manufacturing exports basically did not budge. And here I break the products up into two types. The light blue are those in which the U.S. did not place a tariff. The dark blue, those that we did place a tariff. And you see that China just did not lose global market share in these goods, even though it lost U.S. market share. So whatever it didn't sell in the United States, it made up elsewhere. I'll conclude with the next slide, which shows you the flows of foreign direct investment into China through the end of 2019, which are the latest numbers that we had available. And you see that, that in the last few years, the flows have increased slightly. So there's a big world out there, the U.S. Decoupling, quote unquote, through this series of tit-for-tat tariff increases and the general increase in tariff walls between the two countries. In some sense, it's just isolating China and the U.S. from each other, but it's not decoupling China from the rest of the world. I'll leave it there. The rest of my slides focus on the movement of supply chains, something I hope we can talk about in the Q&A.
Okay, Mary, thank you for that excellent presentation. And by the way, everyone is welcome to raise their hands, your Zoom hand, or put questions in the chat, and we will, I promise we will get to you. Before we go to Dr. Henry Wang, who's been very kind to stay awake for us through this whole through this presentation, even though it's very late in Beijing, I want to ask Mary one question, the same question that I asked Bob Davis. Do you agree with Bob's assessment? What does it look like if Trump wins? What does it look like if Biden wins? How will this picture change?
Yes, I mean, Bob was spot on. in a Trump administration, I think that we are in for more of the rhetoric, perhaps even a heightened rhetoric, because of the fact that, as Bob noted and related to us quite succinctly, the phase one topics were easier than phase two. And so we're going to get into topics which really get into the meat, cut to the bone, role of state-owned enterprises and subsidization being two very big ones, but also the role of China. We're seeing an increase heating up in the tech sphere and a decoupling in the tech sphere, which has been very sensitive on both sides. So I think that we've also learned with President Trump that we are subject to, in some sense, this back and forth that Bob described between the blue collar Trump and the white and the Wall Street Trump. And that lends a tremendous amount of uncertainty to business relationships. I think that we will see American businesses, unfortunately, pulling away from the United States because of that. So we hear a lot about pulling the supply chains home, but there is a big repellent effect of this. We don't see any evidence from companies operating in China that they're leaving China. The market's just too important, and it's going to grow faster than the rest of the world. So they need to be there, and they'll stay there. On the Biden side, I think the important thing, very important, is that while he's certainly not by any means much softer on China than the U.S. is, a very important difference is working with the allies. Trump, when he discusses China, seems to think we're in a two-country world. We clearly are not. We have left many of our most potent tools for persuading the Chinese to act in different ways on the table by not working with our allies. And I think that will be a very major difference of a Biden administration versus the second Trump administration.
Okay, well, thank you so much. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Wang. So Henry Wang is the founder and president of the Center for China and Globalization. He's also a counselor on the China State Council and a very distinguished analyst. Thank you for your patience, and I'm going to turn it over to you to give us the view from Beijing and your own.
Thank you, Sonny, and good morning, friends, and also distinguished panelists. Yeah, I think this is a fascinating discussion on the topic, and also I enjoyed Bob's talk, and also I hear your talk with Wendy Cutler some time ago, and also very pleased to see Mary again. I'm glad you were at our CCG webinar a while ago. So it's really a very interesting topic today. The topic I'd like to share is talk about the future of China-U.S. relations. So we'll give some ideas about trade, of course, phase one, and then also I want to talk about a bit of the other areas. Maybe we'll have a first slide, Telson. Thank you. Yeah, so the topic I've talked about is the U.S. China trade war, and of course, phase one deal. And I will give a little bit of analysis of current China-U.S. economic interdependency. And also, I will try to project three scenarios of future China-U.S. relations. And of course, the one of the study we're currently doing now, I want to share a bit of that, is non-government cooperation between China and the U.S. In fighting COVID-19. And finally, I will share some of our resources. Next one, please. So basically, China and U.S. trade and the phase one deal, as Mara has just said very well, that it has been developed from the trade war for the last 2 years, 2 years and a half probably. And then actually the phase one deal signed in January was that the goal of the phase one is that $200 billion US increase in the U.S. exports in the area of energy, agriculture, manufacturing, and other goods to China over the basically this year and next year, over 2 years period of time. So we actually seen that there are some actions already taken, even with COVID-19. We see that the first quarter of 2020, which China already imported over $5 billion US worth of agricultural goods, so which represents 110% increase over the last year. And actually they bought 3.1 billion worth of soybeans, which is President Trump very cared about his farmers, and that is about 210% increase over the last year. So we had bought over almost $700 million of worth of pork. So you can see actually with this devastating pandemic, China didn't stop buying, and actually China is trying its efforts to increase that. So the first 5 months of 2020, China imported over 600 million also worth of energy product. Of course, this is a bit low because of energy sharp decline in prices and different situations of that. And China importers continue to increase its U.S. soybean purchase, actually picking up another 2.2 million metric tons of oil seeds in the 2 weeks of June 11, actually just this month, according to the USDA data. So in a nutshell, I think the Chinese government, even with such a deteriorating China-US relations, the government actually still stick to its commitment. Actually, in National People's Congress just concluded at the end of last month, Chinese Premier Li Keqiang has reaffirmed Chinese position that China will work with U.S. to implement the Phase 1 deal. So that shows the importance. Next one, please. So you can see that actually, despite of the trade war, China and the U.S. actually remain economic partners. And then there's a lot of people talk about decoupling, and I think that which is it's very hard to do so for this divorce. You can see that China and the U.S. economy is deeply intertwined. Just give you examples. Trade between China and the U.S. rose sharply in April from prior months among the COVID-19 pandemic, making China America's largest trading partner. So you can see actually trading between the two countries increased to almost 40 billion in April, up over 40% over prior months, actually surpassing Mexico and Canada. On the other hand, you can see that U.S. trade with Mexico, which is the top trade partner for U.S., fell 46% and in April. And also U.S. trade with Canada, which remains also U.S. #2 trading partner, fell 42% also in April, so prominent in April. And then U.S. trade with India for over 40%, France almost 50%, Israel 40%, and Russia 40%. Yet with China, it's only for about 6.7%. So you can see that actually China is probably the largest carrier of U.S. trade and also stabilizer of U.S. trade and the U.S. economy to some extent. That even though U.S. was trying to decouple, it's such a difficult time, and that shows that even in such a difficult time, China is actually trading, is supporting the U.S. And then U.S. actually, China and U.S. are largely depend on each other, and it's so difficult to decouple. While trading number with other countries fell sharply in April. So let's see the next page, please. So actually another economic data, we just had the event with World Bank. So the World Bank actually did its first outreach event at the CCG at our think tank actually just about a week ago. They just released the global economic prospects, and the World Bank actually forecast the global GDP will shrink by 5.2% worldwide by 2020. And by 7% for the developed countries, developed world, probably including US as well, whereas China is the only major economy expected to grow positively up at 1%. And domestic experts in China predict this China will probably go 2 to 3%. So you can see even the World Bank actually, which has projected the world economy on most of the time, it's quite accurate. Already says that China's economy is so resilient and so so strong, even with such a devastating worldwide crisis since 1840s. I mean, World Bank even said that. So we can see how Chinese economy is very strong. Next one, please. And we'll see the next page, and you can see that even World Bank has predicted that. So for the U.S. China relation, actually, CCG and the Hudson Institute, we actually co-hosted the event about 2 years ago. This was 1 week before Vice President Pence spoke at Hudson. I spoke there, and so we actually released a report called 40 Years of Sino-U.S. Relations, Past, Present, Future, and Policy Options. So this report is available online, and I also attached to our resource. We give a comprehensive analysis of U.S.-China trade relations and what's our recommendations. And also, we predict the 3 scenarios there that we have outlined in that report. Next, please. So actually, the U.S.-China trade relations is really very difficult to see. So we can see that, personally, actually CCG was trying to predict that maybe we'll have a 3 scenario. So scenario 1 is that because the 2 countries' economy is so much intertwined, and decoupling is really remain very difficult. I think that even some people want to do that, but China and U.S. are really after 4 decades of building up this relation. So Rome is not building one day, and I think that it's very difficult to decouple because U.S.-China are closely intertwined, connected, and China is having a huge market. We see so many U.S. companies actually coming to China. Tesla built a big plant in China, expanding in Shanghai again. ExxonMobil is invested $10 billion US dollars plant in Guangdong, and also we see Walmart is actually opened another 500 public outlets in China. And Honeywell just opened the emerging market center in Wuhan, Hubei, where is the pandemic just hit that place. So you can see U.S. confidence, business confidence in China is still very strong. And so we'll see this relation is very difficult to decouple with and also American Express, after so many years now, for getting their full license now in China. So we see actually things are actually positive for the U.S. companies. So I think that could be still a good benefit to keep the 2 economies together. The scenario 2 we predict is that there could be partial decoupling. That's possible too, is that especially in the high-tech areas such as 5G, that we can see, like U.S. has GPS, China just had a Beidou system, completely launched 30 satellites, and China, their position in Beidou is actually not only can track where you are, and then the people who can track where the people tracking them are, so they can track on both ends. And so it's actually very advanced technology China just developed. Scenario 3 is that we probably will see, that's also the worst scenario, which we don't want to see, but it's quite possible also, is that there's going to be the complete decoupling, and the world will be divided into 2 camps probably. So we see probably U.S. is with free trade with NAFTA, and with EU, maybe Japan. The developed world maybe have some kind of a trade blocks, and then China will probably develop more with ASEAN. ASEAN is already taking over U.S. as the largest trading partner with China, except the month of April. And so also Asia is going to be more than 50% of the world GDP since this year, 2020. We're overtaking half of that. And so also we see Belt and Road for China with 130 countries. So if that is 2 camps established, I think it's really bad. We are going to have a lot of waste. Everything has to invent twice. Everything has to do, the efficiency will be gone, and also probably there will be, block of each other, and that's really bad. Like what the U.S. is doing now, blocking 5G, which is the most advanced system the world has ever seen invented. If China going to block everything U.S. is produced, we're going back to the primitive days. If everybody cites a national security reason. So that's a very bad scenario. Next slide, please.
Dr. Wang, I want to stop for just one moment. We're running out of time, and I want to leave time for questions. We've already got some interesting ones. I'd just like to mention that this will be posted. Dr. Wang has some really interesting data about cooperation between the U.S. and China on COVID, and I'm happy to come back to that in a minute. But we do have some interesting questions here on all the hot button issues: Huawei, Hong Kong, and Uyghurs. So let me ask a couple of those, and then perhaps we can come back to you. So So let's take the first one on the Uyghurs. Bob Davis, I think this one maybe you could start us off with this one. Will the passage of the Uyghur Human Rights Act, along with growing evidence of forced labor in camps, have an impact on U.S.-China trade relations? Have the moves against Chinese tech companies for their role in Xinjiang human rights abuses had any impact? And can you comment on this in connection with remarks made by former National Security Advisor John Bolton on what Trump allegedly said to Xi about the Uyghur issue?
Right. So let me start with the second part of that. I don't, excuse me, I don't know if Trump said what Bolton said he said. I think what you do is just sort of look at the evidence. I mean, there have been some companies that have been hit with sanctions for doing business in Xinjiang, but frankly, kind of minor companies. My skeptical guess is that no, it's probably not going to make that much of a difference. I mean, you look back at the history of U.S. China relations, not just with this administration, but you know, with basically every administration, there have always been human rights challenges, and always, frankly, the economics have prevailed. I mean, think about the opening of China to the West. Richard Nixon goes to China during the Cultural Revolution. The Cultural Revolution, you know, in modern Chinese history, the biggest, you know, grossest violation of human rights. And that's the moment he picks to try to open up China. So, and there's, I mean, I can go on, and we have a lot of it in the book about how the U.S., you know, after a number of efforts, you know, prioritizes economics over human rights violations. So I doubt it. I think under a Biden administration, it's possible it would be a bigger, more significant issue, because it has tended to be something that the Democratic Congress has looked at.
Okay, Dr. Lovely, similar question for you. So economically ineffective. What about politically? Do you see anything in the data based on the past that any of these sanctions that have been imposed, either Tiananmen or as Bob earlier on China for human rights, has had any effect whatsoever?
Well, you know, I have to say this isn't my area of expertise, but what we have looked at is the effect of the tariff war. And we found in particular that the retaliatory tariffs by China were were effective, that support for Republican candidates fell in those areas which were most affected by retaliatory tariffs. So the tariffs are politically salient. I think, though, that now, and I've said this before, I think that the value that Trump is going to get by continuing to beat this horse is pretty small. He's affected tariff flows significantly. The only thing that remains, the part of the bundle that remains untaxed, I think, is very sensitive politically. It's going to be your Apple iPhone, your iPad, and I don't think he wants to go that far. So this is with the tariffs. I think many people are confused as to exactly why we have the tariffs. Many people would throw all of the sins that they see with China's behavior into that mix. It's just not getting us anywhere, and I think the political salience is actually dissipating.
Okay. We have a question here, Henry, for you. Despite these close economic linkages between the U.S. and China, how to resolve their differences on everything from public health to human rights? Do you see a way forward to de-escalate the situation, which is frankly getting hot, and according to pretty much all analysts will get even hotter between now and November?
Yeah, thank you, Sonny. I think there could be a way. The way I see is that probably on both sides we need some a new narrative and a new thinking as well. For example, one of the most frequent heard about complaints about China is that we let China open, and we let China into WTO, and then they didn't convert, they didn't become one of us. The system is not like us. So that's actually, if you think like that, if you think the bottle is half empty, that's really bad, because That's going to make you complain about everything. But if you think on the other side, look, China is actually, anybody go to China 40 years ago would not deny China has transformed fundamentally and hugely on Earth. And China has actually lifted 800 million people out of poverty. That represents 70% of the world poverty reduction. And China is now built the fastest trade network in the world. And China become the largest trading nation to 130 countries, contributed 40% of world GDP growth. So, just imagine one Middle East country export a few million refugees. That distorted the whole Europe and Brexit and deglobalization and whatever. But you just imagine 800 million people, if just 5% of that become refugee, flooded the world will be in chaos. So a prosperous, stable, and modern China, also the China's human rights and liberty has improved enormous compared with 40 years ago. Of course, still needs to be improved. So if we think China is already good, it's already a reliable. Now I will just give you the numbers. During this pandemic, China becomes such a strong supporter to the world economy. So if just like Deng Xiaoping said, it doesn't matter black cat or white cat as long as cat is smiles. So if the China system works well, Fukuyama-san's end of history may not really, U.S. has to change a viewing of China. So if you look China live a different life, China could be a strong partner to U.S. and many other countries. So what I see the way out of this is that we need to really have a new perspective. China also need a new narrative, need a new, a way of explaining the success of China rather than, going all the old way, old thinking. So I think we need to really change the paradigm of thinking by people of both countries so that we can really look forward rather than we go back to the Cold War mentality and actually Chinese is no longer old China, it's already a new China. So we have to look at new perspectives.
Okay, thank you. All right, everybody, please feel free to raise your Zoom hands and I will be happy to call on you on the air. We have another question coming in on from InfoWorld, Andrew Oliver in Georgia. Have the tariffs had any effect on cyber attacks or industrial espionage and technology transfers? Can you quantify the actual damage done? Anybody want to take that question?
I'll take a first stab and then hopefully the others will join in. It's a very good question, complicated question. I'm assuming that the question is really asking whether the tariffs have reduced technology transfer or forced technology transfer. I think we saw that China was already in the midst of making changes to its foreign investment regime, reducing the number of sectors into which that had equity caps, because many of the allegations in the 301 report have to do with joint ventures and forced technology transfer from foreign investors to their partners, domestic partners, Chinese domestic companies. So that was already underway. There's been more progress promised under the Phase 1 agreement. So I think that there is some movement there. There are many other ways, de facto as opposed to jure ways, that China may strong-arm foreign companies into providing technological knowledge. I think some of that is to be expected. And we have to, I think Henry has his finger pointed in the right direction when he sees we need a new narrative. We have to look at technology transfer from richer to poorer countries again as something that we embrace. It was certainly supposed to be part of the Doha round. On the other hand, China has obligations, and I'd be interested in hearing Henry's view on what those obligations are. It's also true that the subsidization of industries by China, but also by other countries, is a growing problem. People see it as unfair, and I think it threatens the stability of the world trading system because it threatens domestic support for that system. So I'd be interested in hearing his views on how China is not just responsible for part of that, as are other countries, but also what it can do to begin to solve some of what we see as almost intractable problems. As Bob said, the issue of subsidization in Phase 2 is going to be among the most difficult.
Thanks. Henry, over to you.
Sure, thank you, Sonia, and thank you, Mary, for your comment. No, I think there's two parts. First of all, the so-called forced technology transfer. I think there's some myths on that as well. You know, basically, since China and U.S. diplomatic ties, there's about 70,000 U.S. companies set up in China. They generate about $700 to $900 billion revenues a year. And that is much larger than the so-called trade deficit that President Trump is talking all the time. So, and also now, you know, Ford and General Motors sells more cars in China than the United States. So if they do not provide their best technology to China and or maybe transfer some of technology, how can they conquer this very competitive market? You got the French, you got Japanese, you got the Germans, and all the best car and manufacturer all in China. China now is the largest car manufacturer in the world now. So I think there's many cases like that. So it's also as a business decision. There's nobody really forcing. And actually, China, as Mary said, China has greatly improved on that as well. The newly passed foreign investment law last year now stipulates, there's no forced technology transfer and no IPR violation, and if anyone violate that, will be severely punished. So I think China is taking the right direction. As far as the subsidy and things like that is concerned, I agree. That should be looked at. I think every country has a bit of subsidy. U.S. is attracting companies to states. Give you a free tax break, so subsidize for this and that. Every country probably does a bit of that. I think the way to go for that is really we need to have the international mechanism. For example, the CPTPP now is have a higher standard for trade, even higher than WTO, and China is interested in joining that. Premier Li has said that at the NPC that join the CPTPP. China is very open and positive. So I think the way to handle that is maybe through those multilateral venue, and then everybody is doing that. But also we have to see, China's contribution is actually doing much better now. For example, China just, President Xi announced that China donates $2 billion US, helping WHO fighting COVID-19 for African countries. China is forgiving all the loans that matured by the end of this year for African countries. So, China is contributing to the world as well. And it's not that China has benefited from in the past from other countries coming to China. China now is starting to contribute.
Thank you. All right, I'd like to turn it back bring it back to Bob. And Bob, I'd like you to ask you, as a very senior and distinguished journalist here, what advice you can give for the other journalists who are on this Zoom. How can they be awesome? What do you read? What do you do? Give us some of the Bob Davis secret sauce.
Well, thanks. I'm not sure how secret it is, but so I'll just talk about covering trade first in general. I'll take it back to the early 90s when I started covering trade. I was told, it was 1991, my bureau chief at that time was a guy named Al Hunt, who had an unbelievable political antenna, but frankly knew nothing about economics and certainly nothing about trade. And he said, you should go cover competitiveness, which was becoming a big issue. China wasn't the big issue back then. It was on economics, international economics. It was Japan. And could the U.S. stay, ahead of Japan economically? He didn't know what competitiveness meant. I didn't know what it meant either. And he said, oh, by the way, you'll have to cover this thing called the GATT. You're going to write 1 or 2 stories about it a year, which was the predecessor of the World Trade Organization. And it turned out that in 91, they were winding up finishing a global trade round that took a few more years. So I quickly learned the easiest way to lose a reader was to use the word GATT. It meant General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. The particulars of trade can be really boring. If you are writing about a steel tariff, you think, well, I know what steel is. Well, you don't actually. There's like 1,000 grades of steel and it's just mind-numbing. However, that's just the wrong way to go about it. I mean, the way I've always thought about trade is as kind of the physical manifestation of globalization. We write about we endlessly talk about globalization. It is one of the biggest, most powerful forces in the political economy. But what is it? I mean, where do you see it? I mean, how do you touch it? I mean, global trade is a way where you can understand it. If there's a trade deal, you even get to vote on it, or your representatives do anyway. But I mean, so if you keep that in mind, then it becomes just an incredibly important and dramatic story. And there are so many different ways that you can kind of deal with it. If there's a trade fight over God knows what it'll be. I mean, for instance, if Biden gets if Biden wins the presidency, the U.S. will probably try to join the TPP or whatever it's called these days. Henry just made mention to it, which was an alliance, trade deal of a dozen U.S. countries, a dozen Asia-Pacific countries that Trump said the U.S. wouldn't participate in from his first day in office. Well, that'll be a huge fight. I mean, and that would be something that to cover. The U.S.-Mexico renegotiation over NAFTA was an enormous fight. I mean, it's the way exports help your local economy. It's the way imports can help or hurt. I think one of the stories that we didn't cover well enough, and myself included, was the impact of China on U.S. factory towns. I think people, myself included, heard the numbers were a million. I mean, labor people would say, well, it's going to cost 1 million jobs. And you'd say, well, that's a lot of jobs. But there was 1 million jobs over a decade. Well, then it's 100,000 jobs in an economy that produces 140 million jobs. So it didn't seem like much. But it was enormously concentrated in the Southeast and the Midwest, areas that became big nodes of populist resentment that helped President Trump win the election. So again, there's just endless numbers of ways in which these kind of imports or investments affect your local economy. You know, in terms of how I do what I do, I mean, there are a number of publications that I read. I'm just going to focus now on China, for instance. So there's a publication called Sinocism, S-I-N-O-C-I-S-M. It's an aggregator of stories about China written by the U.S., by the Western, I should say, by the Western and Chinese press. It's by a guy named Bill Bishop, who translates People's Daily and Global Times into English, which is just enormously helpful. Inside U.S. Trade is gets you into the nuts and bolts of trade. Axios has a China publication now. There's a new publication called The Wire China. There's something called China File. There's another one called the China Leadership Monitor, which is put out by Stanford, that looks at Chinese politics. A great Chinese publication that's pretty independent. I mean, particularly in a system that has no heritage of freedom of the press, is called Caixin, C-A-I-X-I-N, which translates into English. And then, you know, there's the mainstream press like the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Washington Post, the New Yorker. I mean, all cover China as best they can. Bloomberg covers it, the finance and economics very well. They really have given up on covering Chinese politics, which is unfortunate. And, you know, there are people like Mary. I mean, the Peterson Institute is just incredibly helpful. There's a guy there who's sort of retired now, a man named Gary Huffbauer, who was just an encyclopedia on trade. And I learned so much from him. And he was so honest and even-handed. I'm talking about him like he's dead. He's not. I mean, he's still out there. And he's just a great resource. I mean, I can't tell you how much I learned from Gary. And then on the anti-free trade side, because Gary clearly was a free trader, you know, people like Lori Wallach, who is, you know, encyclopedic in her knowledge of you know, trade deals and so on from a much more critical perspective. She's a public citizen. Public citizen does good work also. You want to definitely get, you know, as many views as you can, and the labor people as well. So that's a start.